Hi everyone, this is Rohit from Lifestyle Mastery at Room. Excited to have Sameet Mehta, who's an engineer, investor, and executive in Silicon Valley for the last 20 years. Prior to founding Granite Hill, Sameet spent 7 years in M&A and strategic venture capital with Cisco, where he established and led the venture capital effort in India. He's developed a diverse network of business leaders, entrepreneurs, investors in both US and India, and he was previously with Lehman Brothers in a technology investment banking group. Sameet holds a bachelor's in electrical engineering from Princeton University, and he's done his MBA from Stanford. Welcome to the show, Sameet.
Thank you so much, Rohit, for having me on.
Awesome. So, Sameet, you have an interesting career. How did you get into this crazy world of venture capital?
I started it. I got exposure to venture capital at Cisco Systems. So I had, after graduating from business school, just a little bit of background, like you mentioned, I was an electrical engineer. I kind of always had just a tinkerer. I always had an interest in technology. And I remember hearing about Cisco Systems back when I was at Lehman Brothers, and actually had a feeling that they did very briefly overtake Microsoft in market cap at some point. That was obviously the heyday of, the telcos and networking and all that kind of thing. So I wanted to go. I was very interested in investing, but I wanted to do it from a very informed technical standpoint. And at that time, Cisco was active, and probably 50% of my job was M&A, but 50% was strategic investing at Cisco. And the idea there was, if it was not a company we wanted to acquire, they would look at adjacent markets, let's say. So something that's not directly competitive, but where maybe over time it would help inform the company by being an active investor in, for example, like companies that were maybe doing network applications. So Cisco didn't really do that, but okay, we might want to look at different applications, whether it's video, security, so on and so forth, and start by making investments there, and then use that to inform the strategic direction. So that was my first exposure. But after a fefew years of doing but at the end of the day, it's still corporate venture, and I think things are structured a little bit differently nowadays. But I like the investing part a lot more than the acquisition and M&A part. But the investing part wasn't as immediately impactful to Cisco. And then that just kind of got reflected in many ways based on your influence in the company. And so it was a really good window into that world, but not somewhere I would say, if you're in the way the group was structured at the time, if your passion was investing, it was probably good to get the exposure and then go and try something as a direct investor, working for a fund or starting a fund, which is what I did.
Interesting. And you worked in Cisco. Was corporate venture different from how you look at decision making at your own firm?
Great question. And I would caveat that there are different models now, and some of that's evolving as well. But at Cisco, and I think this is very commonplace, the venture capital group was not, for example, part of treasury or trying to figure out how to get the highest ROI on a certain asset class. It was really something that had to be sponsored and very, at least sponsored or linked, linked loosely to an existing business unit within Cisco. So Cisco was pretty big by the time I joined in 2000, which now is clearly many, many years ago, but I was there for about 7 years, and they, so if you were investing in, let's say, a company that's doing some video compression technology, you would have to coordinate with the cable termination group that worked with cable companies and sold routers to cable companies to say, hey, this is pretty interesting, we want to know more about it. And so the internal buy-in was working with a lot of product people who don't necessarily have like finance backgrounds, right? Or backgrounds in investing. And so, on one hand, you kind of get really interesting automatic technical and product due diligence as far as evaluating a company that maybe a VC wouldn't have directly. On the flip side, it was a little bit restrictive because there could be a company that'd be a great investment, and you're just trying to, meaning, and you can't really do anything about it without a sponsor. So that was the big difference.
Interesting. And as you pointed out, you've been investing since 2000. And what are some of the significant changes in venture that you've seen over the last 2 decades? Especially, you've seen the big downturn which happened in 2008, and COVID, which had been such an inflection point, where there's been a lot of investments which have been having, where the fundraising has really accelerated in the last couple of years. But also the recent downturn which has happened in the last couple of weeks. So how do you see the whole trajectory, because you've had so much of experience investing in both US as well as in India?
If I were to, there's a few different things, but if I were to name one core trajectory, it would be that the size of venture capital funds have increased, the number one, and then highly correlated to that, the scale of outcomes has increased, and correlated to that, the time period where a company stays private has increased. So all of these things. So and I think a lot of this started to change with. There were some great big outcomes before, but and you just saw slowly, particularly with some of the social media companies, coming out in the early noughts, mid noughts. This is what I observed just being in that ecosystem, right? If you're a venture capitalist at a pretty big fund, it's one company that becomes worth $10 billion, right? Can just be worth more than everything else that fund invested in combined by, let's say, 4 or 5 other partners. So the incentive and the dynamic changes quite a bit to go out and find that. I mean, everyone's obviously trying to find the next biggest thing, but 2 things happen. When you get these big outcomes, you can raise bigger funds. So the funds got a lot bigger. The third thing is, so the runway for the companies got a lot longer. I was an investor, for example, in Palantir. When I invested there, I was a small investor. At that time, they said, we have 0 plans to go public. This was with Granite Hill. I invested back in 2010. And small amount of money, not a huge one, but still turned out to be a big one for us. But yeah, I mean, it was like a 12-year, the holding period was longer than the typical life of a fund for some of the early investors. That's true even for some of the huge outcomes recently. I know this is a fact for Zoom. I was an investor in Sentinel-1. I mean, we came in 2013. The company did very, very well and went public 9 years later. A typical fund life is 10 years.
Yeah.
So that's another thing. Yeah, even the fund life, everything's just longer and bigger.
Yeah, interesting. And you made a very interesting point about the timelines of companies being private. And Bill Curley, who's a legendary VC at Benchmark, once mentioned that Airbnb made a big mistake of staying private for so long. But what are your thoughts? Do you think companies are going to stay longer, private much longer, or do you think earlier companies used to go public and that was a much better strategy? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's going to remain depending on the type of company. So I think, and I know it's not a cop-out answer, but I would say they will, especially for enterprise tech. I think they're going to stay private longer because enterprise technology typically doesn't have network effects or any kind of viral nature to it. And so, it's a lot more in the side of, they use this overused term flywheel, but it's on the side of just, base execution and making sure, because the sales cycles are longer. You're not selling to someone who's, baited by a click. You're usually selling to slightly more, tech savvy, sophisticated buyer, whether it's a CTO or CIO or CISO or what have you. So I think enterprise companies will stay private longer because you can kind of ride through some of the early unpredictabilities without getting punished, without getting punished by the stock market. Let's say if one quarter doesn't work out, and you can kind of build up to a pipeline. At least that's kind of the way I looked at it. where you start to get some predictability in the quarters. You don't have to be profitable, but just a little more sense of predictability on how things work. Whereas I think I'm not a consumer investor, but my understanding is with companies like that, whether it's Airbnb, you have tons of like immediate metric data, and then you can just kind of see the algorithm or the pattern working, and I think it's just a little more predictable. And maybe in those cases, I don't want to speak obviously for such a legendary investor, but I think in those cases where it's a consumer situation, then there are benefits for going public, like transparency and some internal discipline and that kind of thing. So if like the core engine of growth is doing really well, you'll be fine in the stock market, but maybe you get the benefits of some other things. And of course you get liquid. So it depends on also when you invested.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And you've been investing for close to around 2 decades. What do you think would have been some of your biggest misses, and did it alter your style of investing?
My biggest miss was, and I was not going to be a lead investor, but I could have gotten in. I was invited through I met the CEO, I met the earliest investor, and when Zoom was, I think, got a private round at like maybe $800-700 million valuation, I could have put in a couple $1 million. It would have been, and I just kind of held off the pursuit a little bit because one of the people that introduced me just said, "Yeah, this other fund is leading it. They're paying a crazy valuation. Don't bother." So I missed it. My instinct was a little bit to do it because they were just so focused on product, and I had actually covered the adjacent technology of video and voice over IP at Cisco. So back when Cisco had bought WebEx, so the founder of Zoom kind of was at WebEx before that, and so I was like, yeah, these existing platforms suck, and the big, like, I'll tell, and not to talk too much about like the dumb thing that I did, but what I really liked about it, and you can see it play out right now, but this was 8 years ago, was I'm just going to optimize this for you and I were doing at the beginning of this podcast, optimize this for the computer microphone and the computer speaker, like that simple, no extra equipment, and make that as good and seamless as possible. And that kind of caught me, and I was like, that makes sense. From a usability standpoint. I had seen Cisco had this ridiculous product called Telepresence, which had like, trying to recreate a real-time meeting. And this is obviously way before COVID. And it was just like, you would need an IT professional to install something like that. They had huge flat screens, and then just multiple routers. You need to be a CCN, Cisco certified network engineer to wire all that thing together. And I've been away from Cisco long enough. I don't mind dissing it a little bit, but it was just ridiculous. Like, I don't know why anybody would do that. And it never went anywhere. And that was also kind of when I knew I had to leave Cisco. I'm like, this is not where the next stuff is coming, even within the industry. And then the other, I think I gave you a pretty big miss there. I can't think of the other ones right now, but there were a couple, but not a crazy amount. Yeah. And that just means, it's interesting. People talk about misses, and I can verify this if you ever need to, but yeah, sometimes people make up their misses because it just signals that they had access to the deal. Yeah, I did ask to invest in Dropbox from somebody I knew who worked there very early. But they already had Sequoia, and they didn't need my money, right? That's half the time they need money. And I think I got free storage from them back in, I still have it actually. But I had the right instinct. I just didn't have a way to get into that one. But
interesting.
But on that point, I think if you have that, there are now the market's evolved, and if you know people, sort of aside. Bit of a non sequitur, but sometimes you can't. Like, we got into Palantir through secondary.
Oh, nice.
We're a small fund, and that's what they wanted. They were doing an employee liquidity program at the time, and this is all the way back in 2010. But that's how we got in. So sometimes there's a way you can get in it, even as a smaller fund or as an individual investor. So yeah, those are a couple of the big ones.
Interesting. And what advice would you give to your portfolio companies when it comes to run away and burn, given the environment, where looks like there'll be less capital for early stage companies going forward?
It's a really, really good question. And my advice is to err on the side of hiring more slowly in general. So I'm a big believer that the biggest war is for talent and for recruiting. But I think because of that, it's easy to fall into the trap of just hiring someone for the sake of hiring someone and showing the growth. And eventually you need people, and you're not always going to get like the very best person, especially as a startup. How do you track the best people unless you have like some huge reputation and you're the former founder of X? And even then, to get good people is very, very hard. They're expensive. They're expensive. They know they're good. Yeah. And so my advice is get a few really good people, and you have to just crank and squeeze as much out of them as you can. And then once you start to get some better alignment, like there's a lot of like variables and unknowns also early on. And so some of the mistakes I've seen and that I've even made is that, you hire too soon, and then you realize that person's not right, and then you get a fire, and a hiring and a firing is it's costly. Usually the people, it's just costly all around. So, my advice would be in the early phases, take it slow. Don't go for sometimes even ignore the VC. Sometimes I would say we had at something when we had our one of our investors came in, is like, you need a CMO, you need a chief marketing officer. You sort of had this check the box, you need these things to be this profile of startup. But the reality was, where we were at that stage, it wasn't enough for the person to CMO on. There wasn't enough for them to do, and so that that'd be another piece of advice: is slow down and make sure you have 2x the workload you think that person's going to need. And not saying you work the person to death, but the worst thing to have is someone that it just burn. You're pre-revenue and you're burning cash, and you have someone that's like 50% occupied because there's not you either don't have enough revenue or you don't have enough. And this is particularly on the sales and marketing side. Yeah. You don't have enough for them to do.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Got it. And I want to talk about Granite Hill. What was the thesis of the fund, and how does the decision-making process work in a fund where you're a partner?
Yeah, our first fund was a unanimous. There was 3 of us partners, and it was a unanimous investment committee, but with a fair amount of leeway in the sense that, let's say my background was at Cisco, so I really brought a lot of the tech play into it. With Sentinel-1, I got buy-in from everybody, but we're an earlier fund, and one of our competitive advantage was that we could be pretty lean. We didn't have some gigantic, super long process all the time, particularly for an early company. But it was unanimous because, and it still didn't always work, but it was unanimous from 2 perspectives. Well, one is that if the deal turns sour, there's just less finger pointing, because in the end of the day, there's less of the I was always worried about that, or yeah, I brought that up as a concern or whatever. There's just well, you could have just voted against it and killed it, And so I think having that, maybe not feasible when you have 10 partners, but I think we have a few partners. It's good to just have a unanimous system.
Got it. And I was about to ask, how do you create an environment of safety so that everyone can discuss and debate freely? But how about with the partners as well as with the founders that you back? How do you build that environment of safety so that you can discuss?
Yeah, I don't feel like we had that in the first one. I feel we have this in my current fund, and the reason is the best way to make an environment. And I'm taking your question to mean where you can kind of have an open discussion about things, but also feel free to stick your neck out and try something out there, interesting or new or innovative. I strongly believe that it's going to sound weird. I think everyone should be of similar age.
Oh, okay.
Or kind of peers, you can call it. Let's say some people mature faster. But kind of like a 10-year age group for the decision makers, I think is good. I think it's good. I think you're going to be more similar culturally, and that helps to foster, the exchange of thoughts, exchange of ideas without the fear of being wrong or the fear of, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. You pointed out, because I used to work for a founder who is much younger to me. How do you look at dynamics of a relationship where the founder is much younger than you, and how do you build a relationship of trust and respect with the founder who's much younger and who hasn't matured that much?
Yeah, yeah, that's a tough one. I haven't had, just because we're more an enterprise. You don't usually have like a 23-year-old person that's selling enterprise tech, and so there's a little bit less there. But I mean, now I'm of an age where almost all founders are younger than me. Not all, but I'm in my mid 40s, so you do have that. I think it's a little cliche, but I'd say just don't, try to just make sure you speak respectfully. And the way I think about it is for a founder to go out there and do that at a young age. This is assuming that they've already passed the filter for you to invest, right? If it's a young founder, you just simply don't invest. And I've seen some founders, I've seen crazy things where like, I try to stay away from like these incubator conferences and things like that. You see like founders like, you're just trying to get a visa to come into the country. Like there's just all sorts of that. But like, you're the founder, he's got onto something good, like the company we talked about earlier, or I just look at it as the same way that kind of like with kids, just don't talk down to them, like talk in an elevating way from your experience. Assume they have the experience and let them come and ask you and say, actually, I've never done that. So yeah.
Correct. Interesting. And you, especially for founders that you mentor, how do you approach training and mentorship, and what works and what doesn't work when you're trying to mentor founders?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to say it's a bit personality dependent.
Okay.
I think the one thing that works, and this is an old psychological trick, is like, you just make it that person's idea. Mm-hmm. So rather than saying, that not that anyone says it this bluntly, but like, hey, you need help with like culture, HR, like you should talk to this guy I know. That may be true. Maybe just don't say it out up front, right? And so I made the mistake of introducing founder to a couple people that were successful founders or also on the journey, but further along. And I think it got viewed a little bit like in a way, just like the natural human reaction was a little bit more like, but I'm a great founder. You don't think I'm good? Like, why am I talking to this guy? And so if I had approached it in a way which just like without an agenda and just let them naturally socialize things, I think that'll come out better.
Interesting. And especially when it comes to founders when they're hiring, what do you think are the biggest hiring mistakes that founders make?
The biggest hiring mistake is, I don't want to say mistake, the two pitfalls is, does the person you're hiring have a startup mindset? And it's very different. If you're pre-IPO, it's different. You're like, okay, I need someone to run events for me. Fine, get the events person from. But if you're like, hey, I'm getting my first person that's going to handle marketing or lead generation or things like that, my first salesperson, like, do they have that startup mindset? And oftentimes, people with great resumes are not good startup people.
Interesting. And what do you think are the single biggest firing mistakes executives make?
When the biggest firing mistakes is when they and hiring to some degree, when a company, I've seen this in the growth phase, so not the very early startup phase, but as you get, and not quite like IPO, but just in that in-between area where all the teams are growing. And I think the biggest mistake they made is they allow a certain type of person when they get hired as a mid to high level executive that likes to bring their people on So they'll be like, okay, I am now VP of finance or SVP finance, or I am now head of channel marketing, right? First thing I do, oh, these are the 3 people I've worked with at these other companies, need to hire them too, right? And then they look at who's already there and they're like, well, that's not my guy. That's not my boy. That's not my girl, and they'll find a way to like, squeeze them out. And it gets political. And so I think the biggest hiring mistake is hiring empire builders or people that's like, I need to have my own little, I think it's been terrible because sometimes you get the one person that's good, but for your company or for you, they're more like into consolidating their position and their influence in the company. And they have their kind of loyal fleet, and there's some value to that. I mean, but that's something, it's a pitfall. Like I would just say it's more than a mistake. Like if I were to hire somebody or like an executive at a founder and he's saying, okay, I'm hiring this person and they're going to bring these other people, I'd be like, every other person should be interviewed by people who have nothing to do with them, who've never worked with them, and put them through the ringer.
Interesting. And I wanted to understand, especially when it comes to the founders' perspective, how should they approach investors, and how should they select investors for the companies, and should they look at brand names like Sequoia and Tiger Global and look at the valuation of the funds, or especially when it comes to early stage, they should look at what how can the partner or the fund can add value to me.
It's interesting you mentioned that. So those 2 names you mentioned itself, they're very different. They're very, very different culturally. And so, some funds that have more of the traditional Sandhill Road, Silicon Valley DNA, tend to be a little more hands-on. And some of the other ones tend to be, and I think the industry is moving this way, tend to be a little bit more, just down to the numbers, right? Just numbers oriented, like, yeah, we have a brand, but we're investors and here to just make money, not necessarily add a lot of value. Yeah. And that could be good sometimes. So sometimes you're like, hey, I just need like a reputable investor, to fill out a round and kind of help when I call them, but not really kind of get into my stuff because I have enough people. So it all depends on the situation.
Yeah.
But you're and I just mentioned, because you just mentioned 2 brands that are entirely different in their approach and how they work with founders. So I think you really have to, it's a matching problem. Like the one you got to get, I mean, the base thing is like someone's willing to invest in you. Sometimes you have to overlook some things that aren't a fit, to be totally honest. But if you're like, if you have the luxury of choosing, and what was the other part of your question? Brand name versus non-brand name, or what was the?
I mean, especially.
I believe in the early stages you should be less concerned about the brand.
Okay.
Name. I mean, you should be concerned about the brand as a fit. Like, you probably don't want a hedge fund to be your early stage investor, but or maybe you do. Depends. I mean, I've had that where I know a new person, I really respect them, but I think it's the big brands. Going back to that original question about like where's the trajectory of this industry going?
Yeah.
So if what you need from that investor is if your founder's like, I need them to like roll up their sleeves, be involved, help me with recruiting, help me with introductions, help me with just strategic advice, partnerships, all these, adding their network. And that person's like, can make way more money with an existing company that's worth $3 billion, just going up in value by 50%, versus you might have a valuation of 10 million and like them getting you from 10 to like, you're just not, you're kind of, I call it a call option. Like you're just an option value. So you could have like, okay, if they grow and they're big, I'm in pole position to continue to maintain my percentage and invest. Yeah. But in a world of, what the one scarcity we all have is time, right? Like, yeah, I would just, not saying that all people do this, but I would, and then the really good VCs just simply say, big or small, I have time for like 4 companies, right? So I would look at that, right? Like how much, if assuming that's what you want. So if you're, hey, I want someone to roll up the sleeves, get involved, are they on 10 boards? I would be careful about that.
Interesting. And on that note, I just wanted to follow up on what Tiger and Index and Anderson are trying to do. They're trying to build some hedge funds where they're not taking a board seat, it's just putting a lot of money, especially in emerging countries like India, and they're making very quick decisions to invest. And do you think they're just adding capital, or do you think going forward that's a trajectory of how we see industries going, where founders are looking at more capital but not much hands-on approach and help? Just wanted your thoughts around that.
My thoughts are trying to limit the every situation is different type of answer, but generally yes, they're just adding capital.
Yeah,
but that's not necessarily bad, because if you can read, let's say you're pre-IPO and like, we're giving capital, but they're like, we're going to hold for like, you get the sense like we're they call it permanent capital, but like, hey, we're in it for 5 years. We're going to be a stable part of your shareholder base. That's great. I think that is actually sometimes a selling point for some of the, I'll call it kind of more financial investors, right? At that stage. But yeah, usually it's capital, but sometimes it's just money, but sometimes it's good because there is, if they have a history of, riding through the ups and downs and staying patient and doing pro rata and, providing good signaling, that's awesome. That's great. You don't need every investor to, change the course of the company, right?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And Sameet, you've been running a fund, and also you've been part of some interesting companies. Before the call, we talked about Treat Optics. You want, which is a cybersecurity company. You want to talk more about this company and what got you excited about it, and how do you look at managing both as an operator role and as a VC role?
Great question. Yeah, Threat Optics is the name of the company. To view threats. The company does Linux security, and it is what got me excited was the founder was a founder of SentinelOne, which is a company I was very involved with, both as an investor and an operator, and is now public. So this founder is one of the 3 founders and of that company. He's technically the most brilliant person I've ever met, actually, is specifically to cybersecurity as well, like, which technically in general. And so this was a little bit more of like, no matter what idea, like what he was working on, I'd want to be part of it. But on top of that, I think he identified through just deep, long experience in the industry, a legitimate, unprotected space, and that is the servers on which the entire internet essentially runs, whether it's inside an enterprise or whether it's a cloud service provider. Almost everything runs on Linux that's in the server space. And additionally, most IoT devices are going to run on Linux. They're not going to run, Apple OS X or iOS or Windows. So when you look at, where cars are going, where anything from security cameras, all that stuff, they run Linux.
Yeah.
And so the idea was, hey, nobody's come up with a next detection. What we do is we detect and identify who the attacker is all at the same time on anything in Linux, anything that runs Linux. But initial target is servers. So it's just an added layer of protection for your enterprise. Most companies already have like a firewall and then a laptop, antivirus or endpoint security on their laptop. But Linux security is a big gap that we're trying to push after, and it's a huge market. If if every Linux server were to adopt our technology, it's a massive market. So that's what got me excited.
Got it. And is it specific to US, or are you looking to expand? And what is your role? Are you looking at a go-to-market strategy, building a go-to-market strategy?
For enterprise, that's a great question, Rohit. And for enterprise, usually US is where you start. That's typically when you get the more robust IT budgets, and you get the early adopters of new technologies. You get get buyers who are increasingly comfortable with trying something that's innovative, from a startup.
Yeah.
And so the US is usually the go-to-market focused on the US, and then later Western Europe. UK is very similar, but you get like Western Europe after that, and then India is the last place I would go, the very last place, honestly. India is a whole different story, especially for those. Oh, we got hacked. Okay, well, how much did it cost us? If it didn't cost that much, well, how much we pay? Yeah, we're here. There's a little more. I think it's just a little more. And there's a little more just culturally, just more willingness to, there's startups are like, a lot of startups have become worth more than some of the incumbents in a short span of time. So right. So people here, I think the buyers here, just they're in that world, that ecosystem, in that culture a little bit more. So we don't get as much as like, well, how do we know where you're going to be around in a year, right? They're like, oh, you're solving this problem for me. Not many customers will say that, but you'll find more here that are willing to, just kind of stick their neck out and try something that is solving a legitimate problem, but doing it more innovative way than an incumbent.
Interesting. And Sameet, I just quickly want to do the top three. What's your favorite business book or any other publication that you read or listen to?
I would recommend. Okay, so I personally, I love to read, but for me, reading is a little. I just feel like I'm doing business all the time, and I'm interacting a lot with business leaders and learning a lot through some of these interactions. So I kind of like that, and then with that finite time when I read, I usually like to read history books or not. I like a lot of nonfiction, but history or books about innovation, but not necessarily recommendations like do this. So in fact, one of my favorite authors is a compatriot of yours, a guy named Simon Singh. He wrote a great book called Code Breakers, which is, I actually recommended it to every non-technical person at Threat Optics to read that book. So we're having a retreat and we're buying that book for everybody. And it's just a history of what we now call cybersecurity, but the whole history of ciphering and deciphering and coding and decoding, and part of that story talks about the math behind it, and then kind of where we end up now with public private key encryption and exchanges. So I recommend that one. It's called Code Breakers, or The Code Breakers by Simon Singh.
Got it. We'll put that in the show notes. And if you could go back in time when you started building Granite Hill or started investing, what is the one thing you would have focused on or done anything differently?
I would have spent more time. So generically speaking, more time on the companies that were emerging as winners. As we're early stage, right? And as companies grow, you always want to help the ones that are floundering. But at some point, you have companies that are really just hitting it, and they're hitting it. And what I would have done differently is just we always invest in continuously in the follow-on rounds, but I would have done that more. I would have pressed the gas more on the winners. Precisely because of those dynamics that we were talking about. Another aspect is you're just getting these like very outsized outcomes. So if you're a smaller fund, you're in that, and even if you're a bigger fund, go all the way on the winners, spend less time on companies that, there are companies where people did unethical things, and, just trying to squeeze like 50 cents out of the dollar on something is just not worth it. When you could spend that same time taking somebody who made your dollar worth 10 and trying to make that worth 20.
Yeah. Interesting. And do you have any favorite online tools, example, Gmail, Slack, Zoom?
Yeah, Slack is. I just started using Slack. I found that pretty useful. Yeah, and Zoom. I guess. Sorry for the boring answer there. I'm looking for a good whiteboarding tool, but. I think there's some applications on Zoom to do that, but it's been mostly Slack.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Most of the guests do talk about Slack and Zoom because that's where we spend most of our time there. And what is the best way people can reach out to you and know more about Granite Hill?
It's good. Our website's just granitehill.net, granitehil.net, and it's just my first name is my email is Sameet, SAMEET at granitehill.net. Email's the best way. I'm still that's the best way, and I'm usually pretty responsive. So,
We'll put that in the show notes. So, thank you so much for taking your time and speaking to us. I really enjoyed my conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Rohit. It was a real pleasure and some really terrific questions. So I appreciate it.